translated with deepl.com. Disclaimer. This is an unofficial translation. This is from
ZEIT-ZEICHEN.
number 114, page 1 to 17. Excerpts from the 712th Official Contact Report of the 16th of October 2018.
It has to be said, however, that the machinations of the overpopulation have brought the climate into turmoil and change, which will lead to many more and worse catastrophes in the future, and even worldwide, than those caused by the forest fires. The larger and more extensive the overpopulation becomes, the worse nature reacts with storms and natural catastrophes, because earthly mankind still has not understood that it is to blame for this as a result of the growing mankind, and that by its intervening machinations into nature it brings these more and more dangerously into turmoil. And the hammer is that it is still claimed that no machinations would lead back to the madly increased world population, because all manipulations, tricks, maneuvers, practices and other machinations concerning the infiltration of the laws of nature had nothing to do with the manipulations concerning the destruction of atmosphere, climate, nature and their fauna and flora. But that was not the case, because there is much more that needs to be said and that I want to take up and clarify today, to which I then want to add, in addition to what I have to say, an overpopulation subject that Achim Wolf has for me. What now, however, the third millennium of mankind brings to Earth, that can be comprehensively predicted, because now nothing more is to be changed about that what will inevitably result in the future through the consequences of the exuberant overpopulation and its machinations. And this because mankind on Earth does not turn to the truth of creation and its laws and commandments recommendations, but continues to walk along a path of destruction and tramples on the good, the better and the right. The entire human race in no way follows the rules of life, as these exist in the creative laws and which can be seen, grasped and recognized in nature. Consequently they could also be considered and understood and thus fulfilled by reason and understanding, but which hardly any earthling is interested in. And this only because an irresponsible Leben is led rather, which is based on pleasure, selfishness, egoism, money rackets, religious delusion and autocracy, as well as on hostility, hatred, disregard and indifference, as well as apathy etc. opposite the neighbor. Differences of opinion etc. have long been part of the daily disorder of the people of the earth, so that no consensus can be found on peace and freedom. The absolute majority of humanity is dominated by a much-embracing destructive indifference, especially with regard to fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, but also with regard to life, the way of life, and the entire outlook on life in general. It also results from this that no thought is given to the criminal growth of the Earth's population, and the great mass of the mistaken opinion is that the Earth, its nature, atmosphere and climate as well as all life will continue to function and exist if masses of offspring continue to be conceived and placed in the world. It is also not taken into account in any way that due to population growth, the demand for food, at present, humanity is growing by around 110 million per year. Contrary to the lie statistics of the world population counters, is growing ever larger. For decades it has been the case that China, for example, can no longer feed its current population of around 1.4 billion through food cultivation in its own country. Consequently, for the cultivation of natural food in Africa, South America, Europe and all over the world, estates or even food manufacturing companies have to be bought or leased in order to feed the Chinese population. India also has the same problem with its currently 1.37 billion population. And this in addition to all the other countries of the world, which are generally also all overpopulated, including Switzerland, which today comprises around 8.64 million in 2018 and has thus grown from 4.6 million in 1951 by more than 4 million in just 67 years. And the fact that the statisticians etc. lie black as a raven and unscrupulous, that the world population is decreasing and that there are generally fewer and fewer births, that not only knocks the lid off the barrel of all lies, but also the bottom out. And that also with the so-called world population clock everything is wrongly calculated, that is not taken into consideration either, because how else would it come that this wrongly set humanity clock calculated the world population in October 2018 with only 7.63 billion people, while the Plagiarian exact apparatuses list every single earthling individually and make extremely precise and irrefutable statements, which were made on the 31st of December 2018? At midnight on December 31, 2017, the number of people on Earth who were in a very good mood was 8,844,128,002. But that, according to this effective fact, pathologically stupidly calculated by the UNO for the period 2015 to 2020, a world population growth of in about 78 million people per year, although in truth already for years about 110 million new descendants per year are put into the world. This corresponds more than only to a malicious lie, misleading and stupefying towards mankind. Or perhaps it is so that with regard to the recognition of reality of those who claim this horrendously idiotic and catastrophically primitive stupid nonsense, the mind, reason and intelligence are so minimal that they are not even sufficient to distinguish between black and white. And the fact that the United Nations even expects by 2050 only an Earth population of about 9.7 billion on the globe. This is probably the last idiocy prognosis and stupid, misleading and lying assertion, which a reasonable human being can just endure with tremendous effort and misery, without immediately going mad and wanting to fry the dog together with himself in the pan. If these idiots possessed even one iota of intellect, reason and intelligence, then it would dawn on them in their empty brains that since December 31, 1950, from an Earth population of 2,784,382,444 people at that time until midnight on Tuesday, December 31st, 2018, these have risen in only 68 years to 8,953,851,418 people, which corresponds to an increase of 109,723,416 Earthlings for the year 2018. This is contrary to the lie that only 76 million more would be added each year. And if I pull up the following data, which I have recently taken from the internet, then I have to say that these assertions, lies, calculations and guesses stink to heaven.
Internet excerpts.
Falling birth rates, but fortunately the trend is not unchecked. Birth rates are gradually falling. Whereas a woman had an average of 5 children worldwide in 1950, between 1990 and 1995 she had an average of 3. Today she has only 2. 5 children. The United Nations assumes that the birth rate could fall to 2 children per woman by the end of the century. Then the so-called maintenance rate will be reached and thus a turning point. If the birth rate falls below this value as expected, the world population will slowly decrease again. 20 billion people by the end of the century. The 11th of July, World Population Day. On the 11th of July 1987 there were 5 billion people on Earth. The United Nations took this opportunity to introduce the International World Population Day. Not for joy, but to slow down further growth as much as possible.
Note by Billy.
Earth population in mid-1987 according to Pleasure and Data, 5,149,979,380. World population clock. How many people are there now? DSW.org. More than 7.6 billion people have been living on Earth since the first half of 2018. Half as many as 30 years earlier. If this growth continued unchecked, it would soon become very cramped on our planet. If development remains completely unchanged, there could be around 20 billion people by 2100. Population forecast to 2100, but until then, the world population will grow significantly. By 2055, there are expected to be 10 billion people in the world. By 2100 the figure will be 11.2 billion. With a reasonably favorable birth rate trend. However, if this remains at today's 2.5 children per woman, 16.6 billion people will have to find space. Well, so far, here's the thing.
1.
The number of births worldwide is just as much an outrageous lie as the listed number of earthly mankind, which at present is only 7,630,000,000 as well as the Earth population in 2055 only 11.2 billion and in 2100 only 16.6 billion people. The fact of the whole lie process is that the world population liars neither count the world population nor can correctly estimate it, because they only proceed hypothetically and therefore make idiotic assumptions, because they do not have the possibility of player and technology by which they could grasp every single individual even in the last hidden corner of the earth.
2.
And what is to be said about this? It refers to the fact that of all the in reality stupidly lying chatterboxes and fantasies about the world population counters in relation to the growth of the world population is not considered at all, that all those madness and machinations, which continue to emerge from the endless growth of the global overpopulation, make everything worse and worse overall. This is the case, for example, in such a way that every year around or more than 100 million young male and female earthlings will inevitably become procreated by mankind, many of whom, just as inevitably because it is natural and prescribed by nature, are descendants, as are tens of millions of others, although they have already produced enough offspring into the world. Many simply want to reasonlessly found their families, start families, or stupidly fulfill their children's wishes. Or does the devil know why? Simply not prevent this for some flimsy or completely idiotic reasons, such as religious delusion, etc. As a result of the lie fantasy chronicle Bible. In it, the idiocy commandment in Genesis 9:1 is fantasized that the imaginary or God invented by a mad earthling should have said to Noah and his sons and blessed them with the words, and this has since been and is still taken seriously all over the world and has found admission and practice, at least with regard to the execution, in all religions, namely with all believers who have no direct or indirect reference to the Hebrew Jewish Book of Religions, in which the name of God is formed as an independent word from the Hebrew consonant iodine, he, war. It results, read from right to left by the tetragram, which is by far the most common biblical proper name.
Note: tetragram equals quadruple character. Term for the four Hebrew consonants JHWH of the name of God Yahweh as a symbol of God, which is also used to ward off evil. 3.
Furthermore, with regard to overpopulation, the death rate of people dying naturally or through criminal as well as warlike machinations has to be considered, which, however, does not make the roast fat. With regard to a population reduction, because the natural regulation is unquestionable, because logically enough in the normal case the relevant natural law is responsible for it and also works in such a way that the relationship between dying and life is kept in a balancing framework. But because the procreation of offspring is carried out in excess, the number of offspring increases immensely beyond the normal, and consequently the total overpopulation exceeds by far the normal mortality rate and drives it further and more precariously up. And the factor of advanced medicine plays an exceptionally large role here, because it reduces the natural mortality rate more and more, and people are cured of otherwise fatal diseases and infirmities, as they are kept alive longer and longer by life-supporting trans or implants or tissue, organs, organ parts or other materials implanted in the body, as well as microelectronic devices that take over certain functions in the body. As a result, the natural mortality rate, as well as the death rate resulting from wars, acts of terrorism and other crimes occurring to humanity, is far and far undercut by the catastrophically increasing and ever longer kept alive overpopulation, whereby the Earth's population grows inexorably and exuberantly, resulting in more and bigger and more catastrophic problems that can no longer be overcome.
4.
Due to the mass of the Earth's population, the individual human being becomes more and more indifferent and unrelated to his neighbor, because like the mass itself, the individual earthling becomes an anonymous thing and a non-existence towards his neighbor and his fellow human beings in general, because he himself loses his own individuality and will no longer possess any personal honor, but is only a shadow of himself, just as nothing will be more than a robot.
5.
As the overpopulation continues to increase, new ruinous machinations of various kinds arise in relation to nature, its fauna and flora, and for the Earth itself, whereby these manipulations, maneuvers and practices are intended to satisfy all conceivable needs, desires and the pursuit of luxury of the constantly growing mass of earthlings. In particular, the exploitation of the Earth's resources, which hollows out the planet and ultimately dangerously disturbs its rotation, plays a role in this. These machinations relate in particular to the exploitation or plundering of the Earth's petroleum for the production of fuels for motor vehicle traffic, which has long since reached a standard that can no longer be brought under control, but is expanding more and more, becoming more precarious and ultimately no longer manageable.
6.
The inexorably increasing overpopulation requires more and more roads, extensions of airports, railways and tram lines, as well as the related vehicles, airplanes, railways and trams, etc., due to the rapidly increasing traffic volume of all kinds in this respect, but the longer, the more nothing at all can be coped with due to the growing overpopulation. As a result, for many years now the roads have been filled with cars, buses, lorries, motorcycles, tractors and all kinds of other motor vehicles that emit CO2 and thus pollute and poison the atmosphere, to the detriment of human health as well as the whole of nature and its fauna and flora. The railway lines are overloaded with trains, trams and streetcars, and even the sky and airspace is already largely overloaded with airplanes, a dangerous traffic route that also spreads all the pollutants in the atmosphere due to CO2 emissions. But also the seas are flooded with ships of all kinds, which emit enormous masses of exhaust gases and pollute the air and atmosphere with CO2, especially by large cargo and passenger ships, which, operated with heavy fuel oil, are enormous dirt catapults. This is in addition to the fact that irresponsible captains and ship crews cover up masses of dirty oil and otherwise throw all sorts of dirt into the seas, whereby these become stinking and poisonous garbage waters and the sea creatures fall ill, die miserably as a result, or, if fishermen catch them, then bring them into trade and use them as food by the people, these will ill and possibly die from it.
7.
Furthermore, this also includes the mining of precious stone and very expensive, but especially the overexploitation of all precious metals and ores, without which there would be neither vehicles nor electronics, tools, surgical instruments, working machines, hard cash, bridges, houses and other buildings and constructions of all kinds, toys, musical instruments, transport tracks of all kinds, wire and steel cables as well as countless other things and products. All these are human achievements which are indispensable in the modern world, and in the absence of which humanity, if not in the first days of grunting and yapping, would be thrown back so far that it would have to start from scratch in the most primitive way.
8.
The whole of nature, its fauna and flora and also mankind itself, are more and more affected by the increasingly blatant machinations and manipulations of the catastrophically growing overpopulation with regard to health, respiration, well-being, viability and the necessary free living space. This is because all the prerequisites for a healthy life are lacking, more and more radically destroyed from the ground up and ultimately irreparably destroyed.
9.
The forests, floodplains, fields, meadows, steppes, tundra, moors, swamps, meadows, fields, horticultural grounds and gardens of all kinds are being horrendously poisoned by toxins more and more. And these toxins, which are spread in ever greater quantities and ever more frequently, whereby the plants and living beings become poison carriers, correspond to poisons, which become ever more destructive and exterminating. And the dangerous substances reach all gardens, plantations, horticultural enterprises, meadows, fields and forests, as well as all sweet waters and seas, which become poison pools and thus carriers of diseases, epidemics and deaths. This is because they transfer the toxins enriched in them to all cultivated or naturally grown plant foods and poison them from the ground up. The plant world absorbs the toxins through its food, the water, in which the toxins and nutrients are enriched, but toxins can also partly reach the plant through the foliage and the cuticle or outer skin or bark, although the leaves and outer skin also have the function of stomatal perspiration or the evaporation of water through their adjustable stomata. Thus, the food intake of stationary plants is different from that of mobile fauna and human beings, who eat their food, which is poisoned by toxins deposited in all food. What happens in and with the plant world with regard to the application of poisons also occurs in all oceans and fresh waters, in which aquatic living organisms used for human food are bred and are irretrievably contaminated by toxins and thus become carriers of poisons to everything and everyone in the waters, nature, its fauna and flora as well as humans. All living beings who eat meat from the poison-infested aquatic life forms as food burden their bodies with it in a health-damaging way, as is also the case with the secondary microplasty, which swims in the water by a millionth of a nanometer and is taken up by the aquatic life forms with food and settles into the meat. These particles mix with the food of the aquatic organisms and pass into their flesh, which in turn serves as food for other life forms, including humans. Secondary microplasty is formed in the environment by the decomposing primary macroplasty, which is known as solid and insoluble synthetic polymers or plastics that are smaller than 5 mm. As a result of the embrittlement and decomposition of microplastics, more and more and smaller plastic particles are produced during the decomposition process, which also attract all kinds of environmental toxins and are eaten by marine organisms. In addition, it can no longer be removed from the environment because there is no earthly technology or other possibility to do so. The secondary microplasty ingested by aquatic organisms through food is produced as the tiniest particles in waters from primary microplasty, which is crushed by embrittlement, after which a subsequent decomposition of the plastic parts occurs. The masses of plastic and other plastics are carelessly thrown away as a result of human irresponsibility, into the wild, etc. After which they reach the waters, brooks, rivers and lakes to be finally washed into the oceans. The whole thing then floats through the seas as flotsam, mainly in the form of packaging, furniture scraps, building and small parts, etc., as well as miles of fishing nets or ghost nets. Due to the UV radiation contained in sunlight and the mechanical comminution by wave movements, the plastic is then shredded into ever smaller fragments, which in the course of time are ultimately decomposed into microscopically tiny nanoparticles. The degradation of the light plastic sorters by natural processes usually takes well over 100 years, some even take longer, depending on how resistant the plastic in question is, and these nanoingy plastic particles are then referred to as persistent. In many ways, the toxic substances produced in their entirety inevitably contaminate human beings and the entire living world, and as a result everything and everyone is affected by the toxins and becomes ill and infirm, which means death for many. So many will eventually die, but also the whole nature will be affected and many genera and species of fauna and flora will be exterminated, which according to your Pledgerian investigations are currently to be named with a number of about 29,600. Toxins are substances that not only cause sickness, infirmity and are often fatal to all forms of life, including humans, in minute amounts. But this fact is 100% completely irresponsibly denied on the contrary by lying claims of manufacturers, politicians and health authorities. It is claimed to be lying, whereby all those involved in the lies collect horrendous sums of money for their misleading statements of lies and thereby enrich themselves. That minimal amounts of the toxins are harmless for humans, animals, gems and all existence of important life forms and are not dangerous to health. The basic fact is that the toxins, which are constantly reinvented and produced and released into nature, its fauna and flora and into the atmosphere, are becoming more and more dangerous for the existence of all life forms and thus also for humans. This is because, as I said, they turn everything and everything on the Earth's surface, in the soil and in all waters, as well as the atmosphere, into carriers of poison. Thus all cultivated natural as well as wild growing food is poisoned from the ground up. The consequence of this is that humans and all living creatures they serve as food inevitably ingest toxins through the inhalation of air, because the atmosphere is also impregnated by all the huge masses of toxins in their toxic gases. It is therefore a fact that all poisons of any kind are deposited in all plants, fruits, herbs, berries and vegetables of all genera, species and subspecies, etc., as well as in the atmosphere and thus in the breathing air, and are then subsequently absorbed by all life forms of all genera and species. Thus, all existing life, also of all genera and species, will be completely contaminated with all kinds of toxins and will be beaten with resulting diseases, sufferings, infirmities and epidemics, whereas in the future all toxins, which are spread in all nature and its fauna and flora, will cause an increase of various cancers and will be the most frequent forms of diseases, which will lead to the death of the people of the earth. And this will be in such a way apart from the fact that further many vital life forms of most diverse kinds will be exterminated, as this already happened so far in catastrophic way and will also continue in such a way. And this will also happen in the future, and more in increasing measure, because humanity on Earth has become a generation of poison centrifuges, and this inevitably because, due to the rapidly increasing overpopulation, a constantly increasing demand for food requires an ever-increasing production of food goods. So the focus is on the growing urgency, in addition to the greed of food producers for profit and the entire baggage of food traders, to force and increase food production. And in nature, in gardens, fields and forests, alluvial plains and meadows, etc. They are supposed to do so. If food, natural produce, natural products, raw materials, food, catering, edibles, foods, nutrients and food are produced for the mass overpopulation, then this effectively requires an infernal production of ever-increasing quantities. For a long time now, the only way to achieve giant food production has been by poisoning all pests with toxins that are deadly to them, but also by poisoning, killing and eradicating all harmless, useful and even vital insects. All poisons against the false claims and lies of the producers, as well as the users of toxins, have a collective effect on everything that creeps and flies, as well as on all forms of life involved, such as plants, animals, birds, lizards and mammals, etc. With regard to all genera and species and comprehensively in deadly or at least health-impairing ways, as well as on humans, not only in the last and later consequence, but already very early and fast. It is a fact that for decades now the enormous overpopulation can only be fed by evil, violent measures and dangerous and destructive machinations, as well as by the use of deadly and harmful poisons, through which a sufficiently high and sufficient food production can be achieved. So this means that only a more and more increasing use of poisons against food pests can bring benefit for the further increasing food production, whereby however everything and everyone is poisoned completely and more strongly and will bring continuously worse consequences by poisonings, diseases and suffering in relation to all life. And this also because not only the rapidly growing overpopulation needs more and more food, but also because the food producers are unscrupulous and irresponsible in their desire to gain and accumulate immense fortunes through ever larger and more extensive production. But that they use dangerous, deadly or pathogenic toxins for all forms of life, which on the one hand contaminate the food plants, but on the other hand make people sick later when they eat the plant products, does not concern them at all. Of course, pests can destroy entire harvests, and something must be done about this, but this must not be done in such a way that dangerous toxins that are harmful to health or deadly not only effectively kill pests and make them ill, but also many other useful forms of life and even people. On the other hand, the very thing is done and life is made ill, killed and destroyed that must be preserved, whereby the whole thing of poison spattering undoubtedly proves to be a vicious circle, which the earthlings themselves have created and can no longer free themselves from, because they continue to irresponsibly drive their overpopulation to ever higher heights. The whole thing of poison mixing and poison spreading could only end if mankind would finally radically stop and end its overpopulation growth and then limit a worldwide regulated birth control and thus a continuous further decrease in humanity to a reasonable level of at most 2 to 2.5 billion at the end of the day. Already today's overpopulation, as well as its masses over all the last 7 decades, has brought a catastrophic state of toxin release into the whole of nature and into its fauna and flora. As a result, the whole thing has already led to the irreparable and irrevocable extermination of various forms of life to this day, including extremely vital genera and species for all life, which have caused severe gaps in the entire ecosystem of the Earth. This already includes the entire ecological unity of all habitats, because the ecosystem is practically the non plus ultra for every single one of all life forms in their possibility of living at all. The ecosystem, which is to be understood as the totality of the interrelations between living beings and their environment, and thus as an undisturbed household of nature and its fauna and flora, is founded as the smallest ecological unit of each habitat, with all living beings existing in it and inherent in it, which only guarantees the viability and possibility of life of each individual and also of all forms of life at all. This vital system, however, has already been criminally impaired by the Earthlings through their weak-minded overpopulation breeding, and in part has already been irreparably destroyed. In the future, however, they will now be reckless and irresponsible through the further breeding of an even more extensive mass overpopulation of the world to drive everything into complete destruction, and are actually about to do so through the criminal machinations and manipulations of the overpopulation, which will make everything much worse in the coming times, because descendants will continue to be conceived over descendants. The earthly shank will ultimately overflow completely and the whole world will fall into a hopeless chaos. And this will be the result of it because furthermore no worldwide, most urgently necessary radical and total birth stop and no worldwide necessary rigorous birth control will be carried out. This is because the irresponsibility of the Earthlings leads to the field that the whole thing of having children is a private matter and has nothing to do with self-responsibility, nor with the well-being of the planet, nature, its fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate, with life itself, and therefore also not with the future possibility of existence of earthly mankind as well as nature and its fauna and flora in general.
10.
As a result of the ever-increasing overpopulation and the predatory activities of the overpopulation in terms of the exploitation of Earth resources, everything will continue to increase catastrophically and ultimately lead to disaster and an Earth human tragedy. This is also stated by the which for the first time has raised the so-called on the 19th of December 1987, which was fixed for 1 year. This was done to determine a predicted consumption of Earth resources for a period of 12 months. Since then, however, the overpopulation and its machinations with regard to the exploitation of Earth resources have led to a significant advance of the date every year, because the determined amount of Earth resources is exceeded months before the end of the determined year, followed by and the Earth resources are irresponsibly exploited and consumed far beyond the determined amount. As I know, the International calculates every year the meaningful day on which the Earth resource consumption of mankind overtakes the regenerability of our ecosystems, which you have said about, and I am of the same opinion that this estimated regenerability is absolutely illusory. Basically, the Earthlings of today and tomorrow live in the debt of all future generations with regard to the use of Earth resources. Also in this year 2018 a new record was broken worldwide, because that took place in practically all states much earlier, as the year for year was again and again the case, and it will be also in the future like that. In 2018, for example, in Europe the resource limit was already exceeded on the 1st of August, and since then people have been living on the consumption account for the next period and thus on credit. In comparison to the previous year, Earth Overshoot Day has moved forward again, as it has always done before, instead of Earth's overpopulation having committed itself to global justice and the preservation of livelihoods. Actually, the eco account in Europe was already overdrawn on the 2nd of May 2018, whereby the reason for this lies particularly with the high CO2 emissions in the areas of energy, transport, construction, all motorsports and industrial gardening and agriculture, as well as with the very high land use in relation to the enormous number of cattle for meat production. Especially with regard to the mass production of meat for the overpopulation, it has to be considered that, according to your very exact pledgarian data, more than 1.24 billion respectively more than 1 billion and 240 million cattle are kept and fattened for meat production on Earth. The fact is that every time a cattle burps or lets off wind, it emits methane. Methane, however, is a potent greenhouse gas that can be calculated over 10 decades or 100 years, as Fath explained to me, heating the climate about 27 times more than CO2 can do. So also the worldwide enormous mass of cattle and other animals and gems of all kinds bred by the masses is complicit in the climate change, which leads back however in principle to machinations and manipulations of the overpopulation, which provides further copulating for the fact that this continues to grow ever more and fast. In addition to all the catastrophic overpopulation machinations in relation to the enormous methane gas production by cattle, it would be particularly important to reduce and minimize the CO2 production as fast as possible in every conceivable way. However, this would require drastic measures with regard to the madness of all those earthlings who live with the illusion that they could not exist without explosion motor vehicles, but who would have to be banned from such vehicles and only allowed to those who demonstrably need commercial vehicles. Well, I think that it would be extremely necessary and especially important, e.g., with regard to CO2 reduction, for natural CO2 storage to be built up and for such projects to be promoted. In this area I am thinking, among other things, of naturally dried out moors and marshes or swamps that have been dried out by humans, which would be of particular importance for storing CO2 due to or, in this respect, I am thinking of natural and anthropogenic or human influences on the carbon stocks in soils. In particular, in my opinion, a re-etting of degraded or reduced and in my sense drained moor and swamp sites would be useful and necessary. The reason for this is that re-etting moors and marshes would bring a great deal of benefit, because, as Fath explained when he talked about what will happen in the future in this respect, and I can logically understand his explanations, the climate impact of moors and marshes is very considerable. A moor re-etting and swamp re-etting, i.e., a water resaturation of the moors and swamps, explained your father's Fath, would restore their natural state and its important function, because moors and swamps and the like would store carbon dioxide and thus contribute to climate protection. However, the more the water level is lowered by natural drought or natural catastrophes, or by humanly stupid drainage and draining, the more the organic substances in the form of peat are decomposed by microbial activities or by processes caused by microbes, whereby more climate-damaging carbon dioxide and laughing gas are released. As I learned from Sfath, bogs and marshes are very important prerequisites that are of great importance to the ecosystem as a whole, and the following 5 points are particularly important if I remember his explanations correctly.
1. Bogs and swamps and the like form a protection of biodiversity, which is of special importance, because biodiversity exists in habitats which contain many specialized genera and species and which receive the necessary substances for existence and livelihood through their effects in moors and swamps and the like. 2. Bogs and swamps and the like, with their peat, etc., are extremely important long-term carbon reservoirs. 3. Bogs and swamps and the like are on the one hand water evaporation reservoirs and thus flood protection, as well as reservoirs and filters with regard to the water balance. 4. Bogs and swamps and the like have an effect on the local and regional climate by spreading cooling all around and acting like a cooling device. 5. Bogs and swamps and the like offer a variety of functional areas for many forms of life, such as habitats for many forms of life, for reproduction, food and protection, but also for recreation and experience.
The atmosphere over moors and swamps and the like absorbs a large part of the heat radiation that rises from the Earth, but this is partly reflected back to the Earth's surface, which forms the so-called greenhouse effect. However, a distinction must be made between this natural greenhouse effect and the anthropogenic or man-made greenhouse effect, because without the natural greenhouse effect no life on Earth would be possible. The solar radiation, I should probably explain, penetrates the outermost layers of the Earth, whereby the ozone layer is the most important one to be called, after which the atmospheric layers are to be called. There is not only one of them, as is usually assumed in ignorance of many people, because in reality there are several of them, namely the first, which is called troposphere and which exists as the lowest layer of the Earth's atmosphere. Then follows a second, the stratosphere, which is arranged above the tropopause. Above the stratosphere follows the third, the mesosphere, and above this as the fourth, the thermosphere, which reaches from 85 to 500 kilometers above sea level, after which the exosphere follows. If the air is taken into account, it becomes thinner and thinner above the mesosphere, because the Earth's gravitational pull decreases with increasing altitude and therefore the air particles or gas particles can hold on less and less. Thus the thermosphere, in which very high temperatures of up to 1700 degrees prevail, forms a smooth transition into space over hundreds of kilometers. Further, I must explain probably also, if I am already once there, by that at the Earth's surface heat rays are converted, from the Earth however again given off, whereby the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere prevent however a part of this heat radiation again from it, and these cannot escape into the universe. If the atmosphere would not have this at its disposal, then the Earth would have effectively frozen to an eternal ice ball at -18 degrees centigrade long ago. So the natural greenhouse effect corresponds to a certainty that there is a global mean temperature of about 15 degrees centigrade on the planet, which also ensures that life could develop at all on good Mother Earth and that it can continue to exist, always assuming that the crazy and irresponsible Earthlings with their mad overpopulation continue to drive up not everything into the last possible catastrophe of self-destruction and destruction of the planet. The greenhouse effect caused by anthropogenic or human influence in climate change will also contribute to this possibility. Above all, this has been caused by overpopulation-related machinations and manipulations with regard to the exploitation and misuse of Earth resources. The burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, oil and natural gas, as well as the deforestation of forests, are particularly significant, but also the changes in landscapes and the wrong use of land, as well as the alteration of streams, rivers, lakes, meadows, floodplains, beaches, hills and mountains, etc., have irreparably destroyed and will continue to destroy the entire natural course. The inexorably growing overpopulation, the planet Earth, with all its good and best living possibilities, is ideally designed for 529 million, but at most 5 million people, in order to be able to exist and live in abundance without any problems, has greatly increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over the last 150 years. And since 1950 everything has increased excessively and from then on has overflowed more and more. Today's global atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, which figures as the most important and dangerous greenhouse gas, has risen from about 280 Wikipedia equals parts per million, i.e. 280 CO2 molecules to 1 million air molecules, in pre-industrial times to 420 according to your statement, which you told me last week. According to your statement, the concentration of the greenhouse gas methane, which is produced by intensified agriculture and livestock farming, in particular cattle, has more than doubled in 2018 since the sharp increase in overpopulation in 1950. As a result, the current concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is so great that far too much heat is stored, which inevitably has considerable consequences for the global climate. According to your explanations, your Pledgerian investigations and research results indicate that 94.7%, and thus the largest part of the global warming of the last decades, is attributable to man-made greenhouse gas emissions, especially from 1950 onwards. This has been caused by overpopulation, in terms of their continued increase in CO2 production communities, because millions of young people have reached adulthood and, as a result, millions of new users of internal combustion engine vehicles, further increasing CO2 emissions, as will continue to be the case each year. This is in addition to many of the cattle and other animals and gems that produce methane gas, which also pollutes and poisons the atmosphere and the air we breathe. As you have explained, Switzerland is doing particularly badly in terms of resource misuse, because the Swiss Earth overload in terms of resource misuse lasted just 4 months from the scheduled year, until on May 7, 2018, the set level was exceeded, and since then Switzerland has been pumping and abusing Earth resources, which may not be needed until next year. If the entire population of the world were to live as irresponsibly as the population of Switzerland is doing, the Earth resources of 3 continents would have to be exploited today.
11.
Only because of the overpopulation itself, as a result of its rotting together and because of the increasingly precarious and scarce living space, the Earthlings will get on each other's nerves more and more. On the one hand, this will lead to increasing disputes and dissatisfaction between neighbours and residents, and on the other hand, infectious diseases and epidemics will spread, old ones that will mutate as well as new ones. And various of these diseases and epidemics will increase in number, because they will spread by poisons of various kinds over the drinking water and the waters as well as over the atmosphere and severely affect the health of people. But also the air, the soil, the food, trees, shrubs, fields, forests, gardens and even everything that grows in the greenhouses. And all efforts to change for the better will be in vain to counter all the evils and stop them, because they're getting bigger and more catastrophic day by day, even hour by hour and minute by minute, in relation to the rapidly increasing and still exploding overpopulation. And all that has already happened and will continue to happen uninhibitedly in this regard was and is the guilt, unreasonableness and irresponsibility of the people of the earth, and it will continue to be so in the future through the further irresponsible breeding of the overpopulation. What has already been destroyed cannot be resurrected, just as what has remained intact can no longer be preserved, because all efforts in this regard will be in vain and therefore useless as a result of the overpopulation growth, because humanity on Earth does not come to the right conclusion due to lack of understanding, reason and responsibility, that only a rigorous reduction of earthly mankind can still save something. This, however, can only be achieved by a controlled birth stop lasting several years and a subsequent birth control that is also controlled worldwide and unlimited in time. And effectively the correct decision is only that by a preceding worldwide birth stop and a worldwide following temporally unrestricted birth regulation the overpopulation is radically stopped, and in this consequence the earthly mankind is reduced to a planetary and nature fair measure. And this measure must be calculated according to the nature of planet Earth itself at 529 million people, whereby this number may be exceeded, but in the maximum case not more than 5 billion. However, these figures were calculated in such a way that this number of people could have existed and lived without any problems for all time according to the Earth's ability to feed itself and its entire resources. This, however, while at the present time the already long overboard humanity of the Earth has made its planet so sick, destroyed and exploited that it is only sinking away and heading for a state which ultimately leads to the inability to live for mankind, if it does not still learn and raise intellect, reason and sufficient intelligence to still save what can still be saved.
12.
If the machinations and manipulations of the governments are considered, as well as the so-called experts and scientists who deal with the climate protection, then it must be stated that all these are nothing else than absolute incomprehension, zeros and rivets, because they neither perceive the effective truth and reality, nor recognize their reality and therefore also purely nothing at all understand what effective thing is. And just as they go along blindly and stupidly in their lives in this way, because they are only concerned with themselves and their own welfare and financial cushion, they also hegemonically dictatorially direct the states to which they are directed and to which they should actually be exemplary, supportive and useful. But since the majority of those in power, which according to your Pledgerian analyses makes up 98.7%, as you said recently, down to the parties, lack all the capabilities and other prerequisites for government leadership, the world is misgoverned. As a result of a lack of understanding, reason and intelligence, the leaders of the governments and their vassals and the parties etc., as well as their stupid and naive fellow errors from the peoples, in no way recognize or understand that only the overpopulation is to blame for all actions on Earth, in nature, fauna and flora, for climate change and the resulting natural disasters, as well as for all diseases and epidemics rampant in humanity. Moreover, as you players judge the earthly governments on their fellow howlers, they would be the greatest criminals to bring mischief upon the earthlings, but they would be cheered to heaven with praise and shenanigans by the naive masses of the populations at all times.
13.
Only the machinations and manipulations etc., which are carried out by the enormous mass overpopulation. The .0000H on the 31st of December 2018 has risen to 8,953,851,418 people, which for the year 2018 shows an increase of 109,723,416 terrestrial people arose and continue to arise through their guilt, irreparable or hardly more compensable destructions, annihilations and exterminations concerning the nature, fauna and flora, the climate, the atmosphere and the planet itself. All this can be traced back only to the machinations and manipulations of the immense mass of mankind on Earth, to everything about disasters, evils, riots, hatred, injustice, unrighteousness, unrest, bondage, wars, crimes and all other degenerations of every kind and kind, as well as in relation to climate change and the resulting violent storms and natural disasters of various dimensions. If climate conferences are held by the irresponsible and irresponsible rulers and their vassals, etc., as well as by scientists more than, experts more than inexperts more than or by other know-it-alls, where the most expensive feasting and binge drinking is probably the most important thing, then only stupid and idiotic palavers are held, after which stupid and idiotic and completely useless decisions are made. On the one hand, all these pointless decisions at climate conferences, etc., are of no use and are just as unthinking as other plans of all kinds, which are supposed to solve existing and new problems. And the whole thing is, therefore, pointless, because with everything the further annually increasing 100 to 110 million mass of the further increasing overpopulation, as well as the 100 to 110 million mass of the growing up and becoming capable of procreation, enter again into the cycle of the destruction, annihilation and extermination progressive on the planet. This in particular on the one hand by the new use of millions further into the enterprise of reaching explosion motor vehicles, on the other hand in relation to the overpopulation in their increase, which is continued by already older adults by means of copulations to the offspring production, the continued driving of the population increase additionally. These problems alone are not considered, nor are many other urgencies, because all the climate conference participants are in no way educated in all the necessities that arise and would be necessary to bring a climate conference to the crucial points from which they could work out effective, helpful solutions, arrange the right thing, which would then have to be carried out. And in this respect, the first priority would be elaboration and enactment of a worldwide legal birth ban for 7 years, according to which an unlimited birth regulation would have to be prevented in the same way in order to reduce the rest of the overpopulation and thereafter a renewed emergence of such a regulation. This would, of course, also require a worldwide enlightenment of the entire humanity of the earth, in a comprehensive way of uncovering the facts, finding solutions, revealing and exposing the facts, informing and initiating into the truth and informing with regard to the need for insight, instruction, imparting knowledge and making the population aware. So it is necessary to teach the individual human being of the earth how to perceive, recognize, build up, understand and comprehend personal responsibility.
14.
Just as the climate conferences are of no use in terms of improving change, because only nonsensical speeches are made and idiotic useless decisions are taken, which bring absolutely no success and therefore not an iota for climate improvement, so is this the case with practically all private organizations which cry out for climate rescue. This will also be the case, as you said some time ago, when new groups of young people emerge in the near future and demonstratively demand that governments and all those responsible should do anything at all to save the climate. Even these youth groups, which will appear in the near future, will only make empty and stupid speeches and demand measures to save the climate, but in their youthful lack of neediness they know just as little and do not understand what the effective cause and the resulting machinations and manipulations of the whole are. These young people also do not know and investigate these causes, but they all see only the consequences and do nothing to end the climate master, but will only lead stupid discussions and speeches, scream and shout around and not strive for the necessary solutions. So also these young people, like the rulers and climate conference participants and the other know-it-alls and, who behave arrogantly and believe themselves to be gods, will speak only stupid things and make demands without seeking the source of all evils, catastrophes and destructions and finding the solution to end the whole. Especially those climate conference participants who believe themselves to be scientists, but who are effective zeros and rivets in this respect, roar for new measures to stop climate change, although this is impossible with their nonsensical demands. The fact that politicians, governments and environmental organizations are pulling along in crying for the whole thing, which can never lead to success, also proves their stupidity, lack of understanding and reason in their poor intelligence. They, too, do not find the trigger for the already falling sword of Damocles, which for decades has brought evil, terror, destruction, horror, disgrace, plagues, dangers, catastrophes, collapses, destruction and extermination. The whole of the origin of the destruction of the climate and poisoning of nature, its fauna, flora, waters and atmosphere ultimately, inevitably and definitively leads to defeat for terrestrial mankind. This is because all those responsible on Earth, governments, politicians, scientists, religions, sects, various organizations and the majority of mankind on Earth do not think about introducing a worldwide birth ban set for 7 years and then a worldwide controlled birth control in order to reduce the Earth's population and finally bring it back to a normal Earth-compatible level. However, stupid, big-headed and idiotic, expert speeches lead nowhere, and all those who behave arrogantly and think they're gods do not care what the real root cause of climate change is. The origin of the whole, undoubtedly the overpopulation and the machinations and manipulations resulting from it, led and continue to lead to the entire degenerations, which now and also in the future in ever worse measure worldwide destructive and even deadly as natural catastrophes. The groups of young people who, according to your explanations, are already emerging in the near future, who will cry out for climate salvation and make a name for themselves and have no idea of the real causes of climate destruction, will achieve nothing. With their stupid disputes they will not be able to do anything for the necessary measures, because they have no idea about them, just as the climate conference participants with their idiotic gibberish and their idiotic decisions will not. A positive changing influence on the climate can only occur if all toxins of all kinds, which have to be extensively destroyed, as well as the gigantic masses of CO2 and the enormous quantities of methane gas are drastically reduced. Exactly those substances that destroy and exterminate nature, its fauna and flora, the oceans and fresh waters as well as the atmosphere and the climate, and also the people who fall ill from all these things and eventually die of them. The fact that only a radical reduction of all the countless toxins of all kinds that are spread throughout nature and its flora can bring a first and ultimately good success to zero, is neither recognized nor understood and consequently not taken into consideration. The enormous masses of CO2 emissions and the huge masses of methane gas, which together with the industrial chimney emissions form the largest and most important destruction factors in climate change and thus effectively the main role in the whole of the climate master and climate destruction. It is such a climate change, not only as the whole is deceived and misleadingly deceived by an irresponsible people. So everything must be radically reduced in a reasonable and controlled way in vehicles, airplanes, ships, etc. that are powered by internal combustion engines and products like petrol and diesel oil, as well as oil heaters, etc. This applies to billions of vehicles, but they are being used more and more to the detriment of each other, and they are therefore increasingly polluting and destroying the climate and the environment as a whole, nature, its fauna and flora and the atmosphere. But the increasing overpopulation, from which all the evils, destruction and extermination emerge, adds millions of such vehicles every year, which lead more and more to damage to the climate, to nature, to its fauna and flora, to the oceans, to fresh waters and to the disease of the Earth's population and to the extermination of life forms of many genera and species that are important for all life. The entire food production must also be mentioned, which can only be produced in its enormous mass through the use of chemical toxins of all kinds. In this respect, it may be, on the one hand, by food impairing and poisoning growth propellants, or by pesticides in relation to the control of pests that attack all kinds of plants, such as insects, animals or rodents, etc. But also by diseases such as fungal infestation, etc., should be protected. And the more people populate the world, the more such toxins are released, because the endlessly growing humanity needs more and more food of all kinds, as well as innumerable other necessities, which are impossible for me to list in their species, but whose production in effect ultimately destroy nature, its fauna and flora, and affect the
15.
Unfortunately, the fact of the present time is that not only in the great mass of earthlings, but also in individual cases, two people can hardly or not at all talk reasonably with each other or even communicate in a valuable way with each other in the family or in a small circle. The result is that the effective truth of life and of all things is neither reasonably nor intelligently fathomed, let alone discussed, because no valuable mediation can be achieved from the ground up. This has also made it impossible for reconciliatory mediation between people to take place, but on the contrary, in relation to the increasing overpopulation, the more it becomes only lack of love, indifference, enmity, hatred, violence, distrust and envy, etc. Inexorably, all earthlings are becoming strangers to themselves in their own families and in the nearest neighborhood, while all unworthiness is spreading inexorably among the entire earthly human race. And this results in particular from the religious and sectarian delusion of faith in God, from which in the foreground in everyday life, as well as in every pulpit of every church, in every temple, in every synagogue, in every mosque and in every other so-called brotherhood and sisterhood, peace, freedom, love and equality are preached and lied about. This, while in reality and truth everything babbled about corresponds only to empty phrases of no value.
16.
If the whole thing is viewed sharply and correctly in a truthful way, then it can be seen in an unfortunate and frightening way that everything is just sound and smoke, and that religions, sects and the resulting faith is fundamentally the origin of hostility, hatred, discord, bondage, war, violence, discord, destruction and destruction. And this results in particular from the religious sectarian differences of the religious and sectarian teachings, their rituals, prayers, forms of belief, views and opinions as well as behaviors, etc. The religious, sectarian and faith differences cause discord and hatred among the believers as a result of the different religions, sects and faiths, which leads to acts of violence, acts of terror and wars, whereby no believer makes even a tiny thought about the reality and its truth, and consequently no delusional believer knows which suggestive nonsense he has fallen for with his delusion of faith. Every faith, especially the religious sectarian faith, stands in stark contrast to the real or material factual reality, from which only the concrete effective truth emerges, which only verifies its correctness as provable and verifiable knowledge impeccably, irrefutably and incontestably. A faithful advocacy of a thing or of anything without the immediate possibility of a clear ability to prove and thus to verify, especially in relation to a religious belief in a God or in other religious things, is never founded in an effectively provable knowledge that can only emerge from a fact of real reality. On the one hand, faith in man corresponds to giving up one's own thinking, one's own insights and decisions, to forming one's own opinion and to giving up one's own responsibility. On the other hand, this is based on the fact that, as a result of faith, there is first and foremost a turning away from reality, which means that reality is no longer perceived, nor is it the only truth that exists in it. From this it follows that the necessary mindfulness is no longer turned to the effective reality and its only one in this existing truth, but is contrary to the imagination or the delusion of faith alien to reality, which deceives supernatural insights and cognitions. All that is related to this, and consequently the fact of faith, is thus founded in an unobjective advocacy of an illusion, which is based solely on an intellect. Weakness of reason and intelligence can come about.
17.
Already once I have said that when it comes to the empty phrases of the being translated and lived, then everything evaporates into sound and smoke and the whole thing turns out to be only idiotic, stupid, empty talk, from which, however, the listeners make profit. And they do this because they are regarded as who diligently go to thee and hear thee, but then, when they have to take their daily efforts upon themselves in the everyday life of reality again, they get angry about it and express and assert their true outer and inner being again. And they do this by harassing, insulting and, if possible, materially damaging their hostility, aversion and hatred against their fellow human beings, people of other faiths, certain groups and those who are richer and wealthier than themselves in every possible way, or even hurting them psychologically or physically. And the more the overpopulation grows, the more people fall for these ways of life and behavior, because with the growth of the world population all evil events of all kinds expand into ever worse consequences, because the greater the overpopulation rate rises, the more among the people the discord and the lack of freedom, indifference and injustice, as well as the quarrels, the envy, the hatred, the enmity and the violent violence in all relations and directions increase, from which finally wars and terrorism are the catastrophic consequences. But the growing overpopulation and the machinations, manipulations and maneuvers of various kinds which result from it also bring the nature and the whole earth, the atmosphere and the climate damaging and destructive into turmoil, following which these are not only more and more impaired in their function, but are slowly but surely irreparably destroyed and even finally destroyed, and besides the most different life forms important for all life are exterminated hopelessly. The creative natural laws and commandments are written in the etc. Also in the as less than teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life more than, the observance of which is of vital importance for humanity. But only very few people take care of it, because the great mass is not interested in it, but only in driving the overpopulation further forward and thus destroying the earth, its nature, fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate and finally the planet, by irresponsibly and criminally exploiting the earth's resources to the last possible usable and thereby also bringing the earth out of balance and in its course around the sun too. But the forests are also robbed, cut down and destroyed by the machinations of the overpopulation in order to satisfy many unnecessary of mankind. More and more fertile land for housing opportunities and new works, factories, roads, sports fields and amusement parks and all kinds of other unnecessary is destroyed, whereby the habitats of nature and its fauna and flora and of course also for the earthlings become less and less precarious, as well as the climate is more and more impaired and destroyed by toxic emissions.
18.
The unstoppable increase in overpopulation is causing a great many other disadvantages, which are having an extremely negative impact on the whole of humanity, such as poverty, which is becoming ever more profound and far-reaching and is unstoppably drawing ever more circles in the population. This also has the undeniable effect of making the rich richer and the poor poorer. This, however, creates ever greater and unsolvable social problems, as well as problems relating to the livelihood and coexistence of human beings, because the wealth of some and the poverty of others create an enormous discrepancy or disproportion between the rich and the poor. But this creates discord and hatred and inevitably leads to violence, which increases more and more and ultimately becomes so violent that murder and manslaughter and destruction result. In the world, or at least in many countries, poverty means that people have no roof over their heads, no food, no medical care and often no social rights. If, on the other hand, poverty in Switzerland is examined, then poverty is usually to be understood in such a way that the wage is not sufficient to cover one's living expenses, such as, for example, a person cannot afford health insurance, adequate housing or a visit to a dentist because everything is unaffordable for him. However, this also means that people living in poverty in this way on the one hand exclude themselves from society or are excluded by others, which inevitably leads to a lack of contact with their fellow human beings. The exclusion from society, however, causes a lack of perspective and promotes further and ever worse negative effects, which are very often hidden. As I know, in 2016 more than 1.2 million people in Switzerland were affected or at risk of poverty, a quarter of whom were children and adolescents, and an above average number of single parents, as well as families with 3 or more children. This also included a large number of people with little or no vocational training, who were unable to find a new job after losing their job and therefore became destitute, which is today simply referred to as socializing. At that time, in 2016, 140,000 women and men were also in gainful employment, but were still considered poor and were therefore referred to as. So with regard to poverty in Switzerland, it must be said that it is absolutely not a marginal phenomenon, even today in 2018, and not because poverty compared to earlier times, when in the strictest sense of the non-proact it effectively meant the deepest suffering and misery in every respect, today is referred to as financial destitution, neediness, possessionlessness, deprivation, lack of money or money shortage, poverty, social impoverishment, poverty, distress, meagerness and bankruptcy. A person affected by poverty in Switzerland is estimated to have a maximum of 2,600 Swiss francs per month at his or her disposal, leaving him or her with around 986 Swiss francs after deduction of the health insurance premium in the event of a low-cost housing opportunity. This means that food, clothing, communication, energy consumption, ongoing household management, healthcare, traffic expenses, entertainment and education, personal hygiene, as well as any club fees and hobbies, etc., must be paid for. What poverty actually is, I have experienced in many countries, and I have also recognized that living in poverty really means much more than having no money and not being able to afford and buy many things. I would therefore like to say something about this, so that it is understood when a person is considered poor. This depends on which country he lives in, because that determines his financial means and possibilities, which he has with or without money. Being poor means more than having no money and not being able to afford and buy many things. Besides, poverty has to be divided into different levels, which is usually not known to the majority of humanity, so I have something to explain about it.
Material poverty.
In many countries there are many poor people, but poverty means for them that they have a lack of all kinds of essential and necessary things, mostly not enough food, no warm clothes and no suitable housing. This form of poverty also means that people do not have enough money. This on the one hand because they do not earn enough through their work if they have one, or because they are paid less, or because they are unemployed.
Emotional poverty.
Parents and adult relatives very often spend less and less time with their children and godchildren, etc. And the longer they spend, the more time they spend with their children and godchildren, etc. But it is also often the case that they themselves are completely incapable of emotional impulses, as the result of which they are also unable to show affection for their children and godchildren. This means that they cannot listen to the children, nor take them in their arms, nor comfort them when they are sad. Therefore, whenever children are neglected and left alone, must be mentioned. As with children, however, it is the same with regard to parents or other adults, because all adult people also have the same natural impulses in them, even if they have suppressed them in the course of their lives through all sorts of negative and evil moral precipitations and have sunk them into a deep abyss. But these continue to exist underground and can be awakened again.
Socio-cultural poverty.
At the social level, people who do not conform to the sociological norm are usually excluded from society, and this norm also applies to people living in material poverty. Therefore, because they are poor and have no money, etc., these people do not participate in communal leisure activities or cultural activities such as concerts, any other performances or events, etc., because their poverty excludes them from all social life. The most common cause of socio-cultural poverty is unemployment, as can other forms of poverty. In various countries this is particularly the case because there is not enough work for all people in these countries, precisely because, on the one hand, the massive overpopulation has more people than there are jobs, while, on the other hand, the countries are already overcrowded and overburdened with jobs in all conceivable areas of work. This means that the entire infrastructure is already being used to capacity, the necessary economic and organizational base, which is essential for the supply and use of the whole area and essential for the economy of the country in question. Of course, people can also become unemployed because they're forced to leave their jobs as a result of bankruptcy or other business abandonment. But it is also the case that many people work hard all day but still do not earn enough, so their wages are not enough to feed themselves or their families and to pay for everything they need. And sometimes this does not even happen if a small income is earned through a part-time job, but even then the necessary subsidy is not enough to pay everything. Even too low a wage alone can not only be the cause of material poverty, because if extra work is done, it can also lead to people spending too little time with their family, resulting in serious relationship problems because too much work has to be done. This often leads to family emergencies and problems, which can trigger various forms of poverty, such as problems of alienation in relation to spouses and children, which ultimately leads to separation or divorce of the parents, as well as, when money is already scarce, when the wage income of one or both partners is not sufficient for living, rent, health insurance and all other necessities,